Batman. Am I right? I mean, when you get down to it, really, what does he have going for him? You know, apart from the car and the cape and the scowl and the cowl and the crims, the rims, the rangs, the meow, the Clooney, the Looney Bin, Kilmer and Croc, the Kidman, the Signum, the Keaton, the Hod piece, the Boots, the Bane, the Cash, the Clown, the Glutes, the Wayne, the Cash, the Owl, the Spins and Fins, the Cave and the Town, Michelle Pfeiffer. Okay, fine. It's undeniable. Batman is cool. But actually wanting to be Batman, even thinking Batman could be real, that might just be the least cool thing of all time. I mean, pretending to be Batman, fine, everyone can enjoy that. But I've never understood the propensity to treat Batman as if he could be real, like actually real. Now, I'm talking Batman movies specifically. Cartoons and video games kind of get a few extra notches on the spectrum of disbelief, but in the last decade or so, people seem to really want to treat Batman like he could be a real guy. He's one of a long line of superheroes that people try to fit into a realer the better sweater, but this inquiring mind thinks he might be getting a bit warm in them their bat britches. As a longtime fan, I've never understood why people want to push Batman, and the movies in particular, further and further into the real world. My favourite versions of the gloomy Gothamite are when he's fighting giant crocodile men, or giant zombie men, or plant ladies, or Captain Fingerneedles, but apparently nowadays, most people seem to think the coolest version of Batman is Christopher Nolan's because they find it the most realistic. And I'm not trying to be mean, but it's not.
I'm still alive, but I'm very badly injured. I'm in an extraordinarily large amount of pain.
Is Harvey okay?
He's safe. Sorry, I farted.
See, the whole reason Batman is cool when he's cool is because he has next to no limitations. He can do what he wants, go where he wants, say what he wants, and when someone gets in his way, he gets them out of it. Even when his own body lets him down, the charcoal champ finds a way to walk it off. His sheer will, his conviction, his mind, that's what's cool. That's what we love about him. And if we compare him to other superheroes who need spiders and hammers and sunshine to do all the things they do, he seems all the more cool because even with his money, muscles and mind, he still is just a man. Except that he isn't. Batman isn't just a man, he's the ultimate man. Chiroptera of the skies, world's greatest detective, expert martial artist, savvy engineer, psychological super cipher. According to the DC Wiki, Batman is an expert in over a dozen major disciplines. Disciplines which take decades to master, and yet he managed to do it all in like a 12th of the time. This not small feat has made him into an all-knowing, all-solving, all-throwing, all-thriving, one-man army super fighter of crime, which, when you get down to it, is basically magic. And that's cool. He's Batman because he can do it all, and he can do it all because he's Batman. But does that sound like the logic of the world's greatest detective? Of one of the most logical beings on the planet? Or is that the logic of God, or Santa, or unconditional love? Love is a preference and that's a condition, don't worry about it. The fact is that despite all claims to the contrary, Batman does have a superpower. It's just not in-world, it's a power we give him. See, Batman can do anything. We let him get away with anything. We give him plot armor. How'd he solve that? Oh, he's Batman. How'd he steal the moon off Superman? He's Batman. How'd he get that makeup on his face, on his eyes? Of course, he's Batman. Batman is cool because we let him be, no matter what. He is cool because we want him to be cool, because we need him to be cool, because he's our fantasy. It doesn't take the world's greatest detective to see how quickly the venting vigilante falls apart if you bring him into the real world. Even in the quasi-fantasy realm of the live-action films, the cracks start to show, and the Begins trilogy, for all accounts, is the worst culprit, because it's trying so hard to convince us to feel sorry for Batman when Bruce is already one of the most powerful men in the world. Now, all power to you if you're a fan of these movies. Movie love is great, batter up as far as I'm concerned. But every time I watch them, I laugh because the characters take themselves so incredibly seriously. They speak almost entirely in these pre-prepared world philosophies they've been dying to tell someone, in a world where this, and this are all totally unquestioned. Can anyone say necrosis? And Liam Neeson weighs 85 kilos. and he's wearing armor. Bruce right there is curling almost double the world record, and yet this is the greatest levity the film offers us as a counterbalance. Batman is supposed to be one of the smartest characters in fiction, and yet it takes him 2 movies to figure out that when he's fighting, it's helpful to be able to look around. And I admire Nolan for trying to make the cowed curmudgeon gritty and believable, but you either need to make Batman less impossibly capable and Gotham less cartoonishly evil, or you need to be able to admit that he can't exist in the real world. You can't have your cape and beat it too. Okay, that didn't really work. Batman is the superhero equivalent of when one kid says, I shot you, and the other one says, no you didn't, and we're the second kid. If Batman wants to be able to do everything that Batman can do, he doesn't get to pretend or make us pretend that someone can do all those things in real life. Imagination is great. We can suspend disbelief. We get it's a metaphor and that only the childish think imagination is for children. But if he wants us to still pretend he's real in spite of all the evidence to the contrary, if he wants to take all those resources and all that knowledge and influence across Gotham and perhaps the world and use it to put on a cool suit and punch things, well then he's a soap opera. All emotion and no logic. And that's not Batman, that's the opposite of Batman. The truth is that Batman is a wish fulfillment fantasy. It's that simple. He's not supposed to be real. That's not what he's for. He exists to let us pretend how cool it would be to take vengeance on all the things we think are wrong with the world without any real-world consequences, to fight back against all the people that have hurt us, to be limitless in our potential for making ourselves feel better and feel better about doing so, to be free of the restrictions propriety and law and our loved ones put on us to wreak havoc when we're upset, to have the world's greatest tantrum and to feel like it's the right thing to do, a hero's tantrum. That's Batman. He's the tantrum we deserve, but he's not the one we need. Because in the real world, the draped brood savior is a totally impractical and potentially immoral response to grief. If it weren't for his bevy of emotionally stunted contemporaries, his billion-dollar procrastination bubble, and an otherwise almost total lack of consequences, Bruce would realize that Batman is a selfish decision to fight crime in a way that feels good emotionally, but fails to benefit the world as much as research into or the redistribution of resources towards crime prevention. Look into the causes of crime. Don't just diagnose it as Gotham is evil and start punching. That's all emotion and no logic. How can the world's greatest detective not figure that out? Herein lies the beautiful hypocrisy of Batman. Like a lot of great characters, it's Batman's hypocrisy that makes him enthralling. Using logic and an empire to battle the world's criminals, when all he needs is some grief counselling. And I don't say that lightly, the loss of family members is something we all go through at some point, including a lot of children, and they handle it much better than Batman does. In the real world, without billions of dollars. And when you think about it like that, Batman Begins Bruce Wayne is kind of a crybaby. But if we transport the sulk with the skills over into the fantastical, in a Gotham overrun by magic and mad science, all of a sudden this paragon of man is an underdog in a world of monsters. A bastion for logic and the potential of the human mind against the darkest nightmares of our subconscious. He's a metaphor for logic versus emotion, for the battle inside our own heads to try to do what is good instead of what feels good. So while real-world Batman is projecting his grief and indulging in a power fantasy as a kind of therapy overkill in a world where he's already one of its elite, the fantasy Batman is the city's only hope against indestructible supernatural forces. And it's a battle he's fighting inside and out. Sure, he could go get counselling, but that wouldn't stop the literal monsters at the door. Besides, he needs his grief to propel him to fight. And suddenly, Batman is a sacrifice instead of an indulgence. He's obstinate rather than arrogant, a triumph instead of a tantrum. Suddenly, Batman is cool. He's still a little crazy, still a little delusional, but now his choice to fight monsters and demons with science instead of economic enrichment doesn't seem so silly. Because how do we know? Laws and legislation can't fight magic. Thank goodness there's Batman. And if he can spare time for regular crooks as well, then thanks, that's very kind. The fantasy world makes it okay for Batman to be upset, to be angry, to punch and drive and science his way through the nightmares, because there are no alternatives. And we like that justification to be upset. Batman as a fantasy character enables us to sulk forever. Like a reverse Peter Pan, he never has to grow up. He never has to learn to process his parents' death and go back to being a productive member of his community. He has actual nightmares to fight, and real-world solutions can't solve his fantasy problems. Enter the Batcave, the ultimate sanctum of sulking, the perfect place to hide away from the world, stirring in your own feelings, and building things to make yourself tougher and cooler so you don't have to be scared to go back out into the nightmare world and face your fears. And it's a much easier option than processing your grief, especially when you have a billion-dollar empire to facilitate your procrastination. As Batman, we can all sit safely and strongly in our grief and fear forever. And instead of making peace with our inner demons, we can go out and kick the actual ones in the face. See, the Batarang Wrangler's single flaw is that he lacks emotional maturity. A rich boy who spent his life wanting for nothing, experiences loss for the first time, and spends the rest of his days, or mostly nights, and his money hiding inside his feelings and a suit and a sad face. The real world isn't full of monsters to fight. Most of them are just people suffering and making bad choices. If real-world Batman knew anything about crime statistics, he'd know that most criminals come from broken homes or otherwise traumatic upbringings, just like him. Only they don't have the money and resources to make the best of their circumstances, the same resources he uses to dress up and punish them for his pain. What a hero. A better real-world personification of Batman's motivation would be someone like Kick-Ass. It makes sense a dumb kid with no power and no money would take vengeance into his own hands and call it justice. As ridiculous and awesome as that is, Kick-Ass is more believable than real-world Batman. He tries to fight crime and almost gets killed, then tries again and almost gets killed. Welcome to the real world. Batman's can't happen in the real world, because then the real world would have to happen to Batman. It'd call him out for dealing with his grief in an immature and irresponsible way. And then he'd quit or be dead. But our love for the offended defender doesn't come from his literal realism, it comes from his emotional believability. This is true of all good characters, but it's a necessity for believable fantasy characters. See, in fiction there's no such thing as realistic, just believable and unbelievable, because it's all fiction. But when we try to bring Batman into a real world instead of just a believable one, we're confusing his actual reality with his emotional reality, and our own. As a character, the scowl and the cow symbolizes our reluctance to admit when our emotional reality doesn't match our literal reality. He shows us the coolest version of our worst selves. The version of us that can exist in our minds, fighting our nightmares, but which would never work in our real lives. And thank goodness. Imagine if everyone was Batman. It makes sense movies like the Begins trilogy want so desperately to prove Batman could be real. That way they don't have to admit his wish fulfillment, that he's born out of the desperate need in all of us to make it okay to be vengeful, to make our reality the only reality. But indulging this desire in Batman and in ourselves undermines the emotional integrity of both. See, the best Batman, the fantasy Batman, shows us that in order to function in society, to stay happy and productive amidst the inevitable loss and pain of a human life, we need to curb our more juvenile emotional urges because they are internally thrilling but externally destructive. So it makes sense that people want to make Batman real. The sulky Sentinel is so convincing emotionally that he makes us believe his reality. He makes us believe being Batman is a smart way to respond to grief, not because of how possible it is, but because of how powerful it feels. Because of the catharsis it generates in us. He really is the world's greatest tantrum, because when he's a misguided mortal with too much money or a perfect human in a world of monsters, he lets us play out our feelings without suffering any consequences. And in the coolest way possible, because he shows us what not to do. He shows us how people's common sense can be sidelined by their emotions, how some decisions can seem logical and realistic even when they're not. He becomes a testament to the power of his character in that the most logical hero can inspire in us a most illogical reaction, believing Batman could be real. Once again, he defies reality. Because in reality, if we want to do what's best for us and for Batman, we want to learn from him, not copy him. We want to harness all of our Batmanish intellect and science brains to see that in the fantasy world, there may be nothing better than being Batman, but in the real world, there is. It's called being an emotionally mature, functioning member of society, with enough limitations around us so that we can't throw tantrums whenever we want, even if it would be really cool. Batman. Am I right? Yes. Yes, I am.